Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Malaika Jabali. She is senior news and politics editor at Essence magazine. Her writing has appeared in numerous publications, including Teen Vogue, The Guardian, and, most importantly, Current Affairs, where her feature, The Color of Economic Anxiety, actually is, I believe, the only current affairs piece ever to win an award. It won the 2019 New York Association of Black Journalists Award for magazine/feature writing. So thank you, Malaika, for writing the objectively best thing to ever appear in our magazine. And you are now the author of the brand new book. It's not you, it's capitalism. Why it's time to break up and how to move on. Malaika Jabali, welcome to Current Affairs.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, I have to say, you have produced, along with illustrator Kayla E, who deserves credit here because the illustrations in this book are fantastic. You have produced not only one of the most fun introductions to socialist thought that I've ever read, but one of the most beautiful and one of the most interesting kind of conceptually, because you compare the capitalism to a toxic relationship. And so I want to begin with a question for you that might ask like the setup to a joke, which is how is capitalism like a bad relationship?
Oh, so many ways. And the book is set up in 10 chapters, I would say 9 of which really dissect how it's like a bad relationship. And 6 of those 9 talk about how capitalism directly affects us in these different areas of our life. So from our workplace, for the conceit for that, I was looking at, there's all kinds of pop culture references in here.
Yes.
So conceit for chapter 4, which was about labor, is 9 to 5, the Dolly Parton movie.
Yeah.
And, we have a boss that a band of scrappy women try to overthrow because we get little trinkets and toys from the relationship. We get makeup gifts, but it's really not enough to actually sustain us. We get a pizza party, but our rights are being undermined. Our ability to unionize has been undermined by capitalists for the last 60 or so years. So each chapter deals with various comparisons to toxic relationships covering different parts of our lives.
Well, and, something that sort of runs through the book is the way that, when people are in bad relationships, they can find ways to deny the obvious reality in front of them. They can rationalize, justify, they can look for the small good things and try to pretend that those are the main things. And in the economic system that we have as well, there is often an effort to go, well, maybe this is the only way it possibly can be. Maybe this is all I deserve. When you start thinking about it with this kind of analogy, you start to notice all sorts of interesting parallels.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the, I think, defining moments for me in my journey to socialism, or one of the defining things that I read, was actually an essay that you wrote about how we always get told that capitalism is an ideal system because capitalists are comparing our lives to maybe how things might have been 50 years ago or 100 years ago. But the reality is that we need to compare it to what the possibilities are and what could be. So when we're trapped in these bad relationships, we sometimes have a toxic partner that tries to convince us that they're the best that we can do. And they neg us and they insult us and they isolate us from our friends. In similar ways, capitalism isolates us from each other. It isolates us from our communities. And it tells us, it has convinced us that it is the best system possible. I get asked that question on a regular basis. Well, what's better than this? Well, can we at least try it? I'm sure something has to be better than the pronounced wealth inequality that we have. I'm sure something is better than the pronounced income inequality that we have. Something has to be better than the fact that we have these wages that have not kept up with production in 50 years. This is not at all the best that we can do.
Guess I was very honored to be quoted in here. On page 11, no less, was saying, you don't measure against what is or what has been, you measure against what could be, which is, I was always hearing this thing, well, in 1910, they didn't have fridges. And you're like, well, that's true, but
Yes.
we don't measure, how well we're doing in 2023 against, well, there's not plague anymore. Well, we had plague, but anyway, right? You have to say, well, how well could we do?
Right. Yeah. Under capitalism, we're still getting the plague. So
Right. But you don't say, well, a lot more people could have died, right? You don't, that's not how you measure it. You say, well, what is it that we are capable of? And are we living up to that? But you also talk about, your title, it's not you, it's capitalism. You talk about the way that people, both in bad relationships and under capitalism, they are told that the things that are wrong, the things that make them unhappy, are their own fault.
yeah, I think that is the most successful and maybe sinister part about living in a capitalist society is that it is rooted in certain principles and values, one of them being individualism, wherein we believe if we have not accomplished certain things, if we have not succeeded in this capitalist society, it's on us. It is something that we cannot get assurances of from our government. We're not supposed to ask for help. We're not supposed to be supported. So, on top of being exploited, on top of having very few worker protections, even compared to how we used to, on top of not being able to afford rent, we get told that it's our responsibility for these structural issues.
Mm.
And the book came out of observing that during the pandemic, where I was looking on Twitter and somebody was complaining about having to work a third or fourth job just to pay his rent. And it's almost, what do they call it? Like hive mind or like a mind virus. And everybody was just foaming at the mouth to tell him how much he wasn't stepping up instead of saying, oh, it is a pandemic. Maybe we need to think about how we treat our workers better.
There was a similar instance that I saw recently where this young woman recorded a video where she was sort of crying because her long commute meant that she was always in her waking hours either working or commuting to and from work, and when she got home she was just too tired to do anything else. And there are all these right-wing people who picked it up and go, well, that's the reality. That's just having a job, girl. This is the way. How can, Snowflake finds out what the real world is like, all that horrible stuff where you're just told that if you're unhappy, you're miserable. Clearly, you're just weak. You are not worthy of the society and the economic system that you are insufficiently grateful for.
Yeah, exactly. And I saw her video and I saw the responses to it, which were very similar. And the lack of empathy that we are showing to each other is really jarring, And so, as much as this is about a system, it's also about like a relationship guide, giving us the tools to recognize that it's the system so that we're not constantly berating ourselves and berating other people for not finding a successful path through it. I think, we have to work on our own value system and question why we have certain values and why we project that onto other people.
Mm-hmm. Another kind of parallel between a terrible partner and a terrible economic system. I mean, there are so many ways in which the image and the reality diverge. I mean, I think you have a number of illustrations here that are things like simulations of like a dating profile and, the way in which on the surface, someone or some system can be spun to look like something magical and wonderful, but then underneath, the reality of it is truly miserable.
Yes, that is my catfishing section. So,
Not who they appear to be.
yes, I have a section called Capitalism, the Ultimate Catfisher. So, you see on Tinder or, I think I was thinking about this when that whole Tinder, who was it? It was like a scammer. It was being featured everywhere. I was reading news about that as I was working on this chapter. And we get one image of capitalism. I think its rhetoric has been very successful at telling us it's about prosperity, telling us it's about mom and pop shops and democracy and freedom and all of these really patriotic ideals that we've adapted. And when you just go scratch very, shallowly under the surface, that's really not what a lot of it is about. Even some of the things that entrepreneurs say about empowering people and allowing them to elevate economically and having economic mobility, that doesn't even happen for small business owners. You have to make at least, or I would say on average, a household has to have $380,000 to have a business. So the average self-employed household has an average of $380,000 in household wealth. So you're not going to find, your average, just your lawnmower service or somebody who just wants to be an entrepreneur and work independently be able to really advance in society if it takes capital in order to make capital. So that's not something that we learn from capitalists. We learn that capitalism gives, for instance, people of color and Black people a chance to progress through home ownership. But our home ownership rates have not improved since 1968. This is before the Fair Housing Act passed. So if after 60 years, we have not even gotten homes, which is like the bare minimum of the housing dream, we're clearly being sold certain lies through this capitalist enterprise.
The other ways in which when people are trapped in bad relationships, it's similar to their economic condition. The fear of leaving, the fear of that anything else you could have would be worse, so you don't want to destroy what you do have. And this, obviously, with free market economists, is constantly saying, well, any attempt to tinker with or repair these deficiencies that you see with capitalism it'll destroy the things you do have. It's the road to serfdom. You're going to end up in socialist, totalitarian, authoritarian nightmare state, to create the fear of leaving.
Right. I think what's important to remember is so many of the things that have allowed us to be comfortable in capitalism were actually brought to us by socialists. There weren't capitalists who said that we needed to regulate child labor. Capitalists didn't say that we need to have unions to give us better bargaining power. Capitalists weren't the ones fighting for health insurance to make sure that people were actually covered. Capitalists fought tooth and nail against the things that have given us comfort in the United States. But if you look at the history of socialists in this country, we've just gotten a little taste. We've just dipped our toe in some elements of socialist ideas and policy. Socialism is what brought, for instance, Milwaukee, it doubled its green space and its park space because of socialist mayors. We were able to get Social Security in the United States because of a school of thought that came out of economists who were socialists in Wisconsin, who said that we needed to put more value on labor. We needed to put more value on workers instead of giving so many rights to corporations. It was socialists within these various radical movements that brought us, the 9 to 5 and having weekends. So if we were just getting that little taste, why don't we just try and commit for a little bit?
One of the cool things that you do throughout this book is that you elevate the stories of historical figures who are often not taught about, people don't learn about, but the people who brought us these things and who in previous generations saw many of the same things that we do today and decided to do something about it and accomplished a great deal. And you highlight many of these people so that we can be inspired by their work and inspired to pick it up where they left off.
Yeah, I was intentional about focusing on leftists of color. Some of them identify as socialists, some of them identify as communists, some of them didn't identify as anything per se, but they were vocally critical of capitalism. So, I've got quotes from Dolores Huerta in there. I feature Frida Kahlo, who was a part of the Communist Party. I feature Assata Shakur, who was very vocally socialist, and the Black Panther Party in general was a socialist organization. They believed in Black liberation through the lens of a worker-led movement. And they recognized that a lot of Black people, if we were to use some Marxist terms here, were a part of the lumpen proletariat. Like they would be discarded in Marxist analysis, but so many Black people weren't employed, and they had been maligned in society and thought of as outcasts. And those were the kinds of people that needed to be organized because that comprises such a big part of the Black population. People like Malcolm X are centered. People like Martin Luther King and A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. Folks wouldn't know, for instance, that the March on Washington, where we heard Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech, was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And two of its, or I would say its main two organizers, Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, were socialist. So much of the concept of the march was about economic exploitation and fighting back against it.
Socialists, I think, bear some of the blame here for, the image of socialism that is often handed down is often quite white. And, that is not necessarily helped by seeing Karl Marx and Eugene Debs as the greatest figures in socialism, because as you point out and emphasize throughout the book, so much of the revolutionary socialist tradition has, some of the greatest socialist intellectuals, from DuBois to the Black Panthers to, they are people of color. They are, so much of modern socialism was forged in the global South, right? And this kind of gets lost a lot of the time in American discourse around socialism.
Yeah, it does. And I think there's a lot of reasons for it. I think some of it is deliberate. I think it is a part of some of the whitewashing that we see, I think, in modern politics. I talked about it in that award-winning essay for Current Affairs, where the support that Bernie Sanders had from people of color was deliberately underreported. Obviously, there were valid criticisms. I have criticized him in various outlets, but there were still people of color who supported him, and there were reasons for that support. A lot of people recognize that a number of his policy platforms hit directly at their material interests. Yet the Democratic Party was using their reputation and tradition that they had and the relationships that they were able to build with Black communities to say, oh, we're actually the party for Black people, even though they weren't actually confronting the material disadvantages and harms that some of their policies caused for Black people. And so that to me is very convenient. It's a very convenient narrative to try and whitewash a leftist movement to advance your own political aims.
One of the most cynical quotes in politics of all time was Hillary Clinton's infamous, "If we broke up the big banks, would it end racism?" Right? Suggesting that, you had a choice between, I remember this rhetoric in 2016, which was basically, you have a choice between addressing racism and addressing economic inequality and exploitation. And we, the centrists, we believe in the former, and Bernie Sanders might believe in the latter, but he doesn't care about racism. And it's just extremely, extremely frustrating narrative.
Oh, it was extremely cynical. And, they were putting that in their back pocket for a reason. It was advantageous to them to simplify it that way. But, as I've discussed before, it was a perfect opportunity to talk about the big banks and their role in undermining the wealth of Black people with the financial crisis of 2008. Like that was a very clear example of how you could have intersected race and class. So it was less about, I think, not knowing that, but instead using that simplicity to try and, I think, muddy her own relationship with the big banks.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about introduction, about your own formative experiences that colored your perception of capitalism. And one of them was dealing with mortgage servicers, right?
Yeah, my family was targeted with a subprime loan. So this hit very hard for me. We weren't aware of what that meant, but at the time, I would say, but we had a lender who just sold us on this thing, even though we had all the qualifications to get a conventional mortgage, but they were pushing these on homeowners. I saw it. I was on the receiving end of it. So they pushed this onto us and many Black families in Georgia, where I was raised and where I currently live, that reverberated throughout the country. So we were sold this thing, and then it was repackaged and then sold to another servicer. And then we're getting calls and emails and letters on a regular basis, basically saying that we owe when we don't. And so they were using all these deceptive tactics. They eventually got sued, and there was a class action lawsuit against the mortgage servicer because this was a common practice. So they were deliberately targeting a lot of Black and brown homeowners, and I was one of them.
No, they would do crazy things. People don't even remember this. Like, people would make their payments, and then they'd reject the check, send it back, and then foreclose on you. Or if you paid too much, they wouldn't accept the check, so you couldn't pay things off ahead of time. I mean, the practices that were in place, the amount of avoidable suffering during that period, 2007 to 2009.
Yeah, I mean, and just to add to that, I had to go through our archives with the company and look at every single check and show them, hey, your machine clearly didn't notice that we paid the full amount. It was not under. And so what they would do is they would short us of the full amounts they paid and then blame it on their photography service that, documents the checks. And then we're like 60 days behind or 90 days behind, because every time you make a subsequent payment, it'll apply it to the previous one. It's like, we were never short in the first place.
Right.
Here's proof. So I had to go through for years. This was an ongoing thing. And they're lucky that both me and my mom, we made time to do it, because for the average person, they wouldn't be able to.
Well, yeah, right. And you are someone, ultimately became a lawyer. So, you're someone who has the capacity to go through piles and piles of documentation to ferret out the truth.
That's right. I'm going to pull the receipts, even if, it takes up my time.
But a lot of people, it's just impossible to do this stuff, or they don't have the time. They just don't have the time because they're working all the time. I suppose we should mention, your article for Current Affair, The Color of Economic Anxiety, because it kind of touches on this. Because at the time, in the 2016 election, again, to dredge up some ancient history, there had been this whole thing about kind of mocking the idea that, the idea was that Trump voters were motivated by economic anxiety. And then, a bunch of Democrats were like, economic anxiety, that's just racist. What your article did was look, economic anxiety is a perfectly real thing. And it's not just Trump voters, right? And you went to Milwaukee and talked to, disillusioned Black voters in Milwaukee. And you're like, first off, swing state, Hillary Clinton lost it. And you're like, well, here's all these people who don't vote because, frankly, the economy sucks. It doesn't work for them. And they don't see anything to vote for.
Exactly. And I think part of what I do in the book is also talk about the whitewashing of the working class. And the reason why this is so important is because it's what dictates the policy priorities of our federal politician. And so when we have Congress members who are saying that they need to appeal to conservative white voters, what they're saying is that we need to just be doing earned income tax credits. We need to appeal to conservatives. So we need to have zoning laws that make sure, that we have enough single family housing, but they're not doing enough to make sure that we have affordable housing. They're investing more in these kind of affordable housing programs that will benefit landlords, but not tenants. They're not investing in public housing because that doesn't appeal to conservative white voters. So when we do that, when we are so narrowly focused on the conservative end of the working class, we are denying millions of people who want things like Medicare for all, who want things like free college tuition. We're denying the entire country of benefits that most other industrial countries have because we are so narrowly focused on a very not quite mythological, but damn near mythological version of the working class in America.
You're listening to the Current Affairs podcast from Current Affairs magazine in New Orleans, Louisiana. Current Affairs is a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we depend entirely on reader subscriptions and donations. You'll notice we have no ads, no mattresses, no recruiters, no sports betting. If you can help us in our mission to build independent progressive media, please visit currentaffairs.org/donate to make a donation, or currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine. Thank you so much for supporting our work. Now, back to the program. I want to kind of ask you what is more a meta question about the creation of the book, because so you go through various areas of economic life, and you show the how capitalism functions, and you show the ways in which we could have a healthcare system that actually takes care of people instead of extorting them and bankrupting them, and we could have jobs that where we work reasonable hours and we get paid what we're worth, and But what I want to ask you is, this is a really interesting and creative and novel book because you work with an illustrator, and how did you think about taking these ideas and packaging them in a way that people in the 21st century who don't want to pick up Capital Volume 1, right? But who nevertheless, you feel like these ideas are important for. How did you take socialist ideas that are oftentimes, again, associated with the 19th century and make them relevant for 2023 in a way that 2023 people can understand, even especially young people who it seems like, a lot of the book is targeted towards?
Yeah, I think everything really opened up when I came up with the relationship conceit. As someone who has dated in New York City and I've dealt with all kinds of personalities, I was just able to run away with it. Unfortunately for me, but fortunately for the readers, there's so much material to draw from. So, I've been on dating
Yeah.
sites. I was like, okay, what does it look like when you see like a nice profile? What's one when you see there are red flags? What kind of imagery can we come up with that will display something in a simple way? So I think also having a bit of a magazine background helped a bit because I have to think about layouts and how to make some of our ideas visually appealing. So that helps. I've had so many different odd jobs. I worked in comms for the New York City Council when we had a charter commission. And so by working in comms, but also being a lawyer at the same time, we frequently had to think about how to translate very wonky policy language into something that could fit on a billboard or a tweet. So I think all of those skills just kind of came together and it led to this book. And it took some time to really just sit with some of the concepts. I was brainstorming with my editor a few times, like, would it make sense to do this? Like, I kind of want to do like a video game profile to feature, some of the standout leftists. Like, does that make sense? So I was just kind of going back and forth with her on some of those things.
Yeah, just to give our listeners and readers kind of a sense of, you ultimately make an argument, a structured argument in the book, but throughout the book, you have things like, timelines, you have memes, you have little fake text messages, parodies of video game character selection screens, you have infographics, you have maps and charts and quotations and just all kinds of things that take these ideas, and you figure out 100 different ways to present the ideas to people so that they'll understand.
Yeah, I mean, and I conceived a lot of it, and I have to give props to Kayla, again, the illustrator and designer, for also incorporating her creativity and imagination with some of the imagery. She just really got it. She got what we were trying to do, and she really executed.
I just happened upon the page about vampires, where there's the different kinds of vampires, student loan vampire, credit card vampire, jail vampire, payday loan vampire. She's done some adorable little vampires. Why are we swiping right on these lending bloodsuckers and their vampire dating profiles? I mean, again, this is not like picking up Capital Volume 1.
No, not at all. So I had a lot of fun. I think most of the ideas that I threw at my editor and the illustrator, they're like, yeah, let's just do it. So it's just like a smorgasbord of random ideas that I would think about, and so for the lending vampires, that came out of a Malcolm X quote where he talks about capitalists being bloodsuckers. And I was like, well, why don't we just make this a whole Twilight theme? So again, there's just kind of theme on top of theme here. So yes, it's about, our romantic lives and people sucking the energy out of us. But it was like, how can I also think about a movie reference for this? So the movie we chose was Twilight, where you have these lenders, including our federal government, who tell us that, we need to be making enough money to buy our basic necessities of life, but we're not getting enough money to do it. So the next thing you know, they come around with student loans. They come around with payday loans. They come around with all these loans because we are not given the wages we need to afford our basic necessities. And we're getting the life sucked out of us and the energy sucked out of us just trying to meet those demands and interest rates and all of these requirements. So yeah, that just led to a whole vampire theme.
Yeah, I would describe this as really accessible because, and I think you and I think about this the same kind of thing, which is that this is what we always try and do with current affairs, and because we have like all sorts of satirical advertisements and such, which is because of what you identify in the book, which is that ordinary people often spend a lot of their lives tired because they're working all the time. To pick up a book of economic theory and ideas can be a lot of work, and it's something that a lot of us don't want to have to do. I don't even want to pick up big works of socialist ideas very much. And so you've clearly thought about the fact, how do I simultaneously convey a lot of information, because there are a ton of endnotes in here as well, and statistics, and also, give the reader some joy?
Yeah, I wanted to incorporate my own personality. I feel like I am a
Mm-hmm.
very studious person, but I also like to have fun. I like to tell my little jokey jokes.
Yeah.
So we're going to have some fun while we're reading this, while we're experiencing this. And when I was writing it, if I didn't have fun reading it back, if I didn't laugh, I'm like, maybe other people won't laugh either. So that was really key for me, was to go through it. And the fact that I was able to enjoy it, I felt like that was a good sign that a few people might. And, I really recommend, if people don't even have time for a book, the audiobook isn't out. I'm narrating the audiobook. I wanted to be able to pivot
Nice.
the tone that some of the jokes required so people could get it. And I think that's so key. We talk about the working class. People are working. They're exhausted. Most of the things that I read that led to my socialism happened when I was a student, or I otherwise just had more free time to do this reading. And we can't have a movement just with people who are in libraries and people who are researchers and policy wonks. We need a movement of workers and people who are trying to work. So I thought this would be a good introduction for those kinds of readers or listeners.
Mm-hmm. I want to conclude here by just asking you about, the people you discuss who are working today to try and address the problems that you identify. Because one of the nice things that you do, if we talk about, the function of the book in terms of making the reader feel like another world is possible, or a breakup with the economic system is possible, in order to drive home the point that it is possible, you look at people in our world, in our country right now, who are doing the kinds of activism that is necessary to create that alternate world. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about, who you chose to profile here.
Sure. The whole book, I provide different alternatives. And so that was the key. Just to step back a little bit, when my editor, Madeline Jones, she approached me with a concept of doing an approachable book about socialism. And I felt that most readers would be most understanding or most familiar with the idea of capitalism because we're living through it. But we still wanted to ensure that a significant amount of the book got into ideas from socialists. So each chapter where I'm critiquing an element of capitalism, I also inject it with ideas that socialists have introduced. So in the chapter on socialism, which is the third chapter, I talk about the work of Cooperation Jackson and the Jackson Plan, which is a Mississippi-based movement based on socialist ideas from Black Southerners and Black people who migrated from the Midwest and who moved back down to the South. So they're working on a project to make sure that we have participatory democracies in Mississippi. I talk about the Mondragon Corporation in Spain, which is a conglomeration of cooperatives. They've got thousands of workers. Richard Wolff has talked about it in his work. I interviewed him for the piece to just give us a vision of what a socialist workplace could look like through, for instance, workplace self-directed democracies, or workplace self-directed enterprises. So it's all throughout the book, but then at the end, I really hone in on a certain movement. So for instance, there's a city council member who's socialist, a Black socialist who was a former Black Panther named Charles Barron. He's been incorporating his socialism as a city council member and making sure that people have affordable housing in his district. I interviewed Chris Smalls, who is the Amazon Labor Union president, who has been vocally critical and outspoken against capitalism and how he organizes workers. I interviewed his colleague, Chris Mendoza, who is a Amazon Labor Union member as well, who helped found the union, who is a socialist. So they all just gave me their tools for what they're doing today to bring more people into the fold.
Well, I really do hope people pick up the book because you make anti-capitalism fresh. You make it feel relevant here in 2023. You introduce people to all manner of great socialists of color from, across the continents, and really, and you have quotes you have really inspiring quotes from people. You have anecdotes. You have statistics. It's just a really nice little primer, and as I say, beautifully designed and illustrated. I don't think there's any other book remotely like this, introducing people to capitalism and socialism, and it very much does reflect your personality. So well done, and congratulations on It's Not You, It's Capitalism: Why It's Time to Break Up and How to Move On, by Malaika Jabali, with design and illustration by Kayla E. Malaika Jabali, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you. Thanks for the conversation. This is great.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.